7th webinar of Print Month 2025, presented by the IFPDA Foundation. I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. The Foundation is the only U.S. nonprofit dedicated exclusively to supporting print-focused museum exhibitions, programs, and internships, and the presenter of the IFPDA Book Award. The foundation is funded by ticket sales for the IFPDA Print Fair, which will be held April 9th through the 12th, 2026 at the Park Avenue Armory in New York. During Print Month, we invite our friends across the scholarly and printmaking communities to share research and insights. We are very grateful to our friends at Print Council of America for organizing today's program, John Wilson, Visions of a Printmaker. This program is offered in conjunction with the exhibition currently on view at the Met, Witnessing Humanity, the Art of John Wilson, which was co-curated by today's presenters, Jennifer Farrell and Leslie King Hammond, who will be introduced by Print Council President Deborah Wood. Deborah Wood is a curator and writer from Chicago. She has served in the role of senior curator at the Block Museum of Art, Northwestern University, and has held positions at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Baltimore Museum of Art. Her specialty in modern and contemporary works on paper was founded at the nexus of studio practice and art history with a BFA from Cornell and an MFA in printmaking from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There will be a Q&A afterwards, moderated by Print Council Vice President Freda Spira. Freda is the Robert Soley Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Yale University Art Gallery. Previously, she was Associate Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she specialized in Northern Renaissance and Baroque prints, drawings, and illustrated books. And with that, I am very happy to turn this program over to Deb. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you to everyone at the IFPDA. We are truly, truly delighted to be collaborating on our shared educational pursuits. The Print Council of America was founded in 1956 with a mission to foster the creation, dissemination, and appreciation of fine prints, new and old. We are a nonprofit professional organization with an elected membership reflecting the fields of print curatorship, scholarship, and museum practice, and embracing the specialties of drawing, photography, and conservation. We continue our mission by sharing our knowledge and expertise through our publications, our website, our annual meetings, and programs such as this one. For this year's Print Month, Print Council has sponsored 4 programs, all of which in one way or another reflect the long history of printmaking in America, a theme that seemed appropriate since we're approaching America's 250th anniversary. I invite you to join us again on October 27th, when Print Council will present its final program, From the WPA to Brand X Editions, in which our colleagues will discuss the history of collecting and exhibiting screen prints at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Farrell and Dr. Leslie King Hammond, co-curators of Witnessing Humanity, the Art of John Wilson. Jennifer Farrell is the Jordan Schnitzer Curator of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She joined the department in 2014 after holding curatorial positions at Yale University Art Gallery, the University of Virginia, and the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program. Dr. Leslie King Hammond is an artist, a curator, an art historian, and the founding director of the Center for Race and Culture at the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she is Professor Emerita. Now, please welcome our first speaker, Jennifer Farrell.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the warm introduction, Deb. Thank you, Deb and Freda, for the opportunity to present on John Wilson. John Wilson once said, "I am a Black artist. I am a Black person. To me, my experience as a Black person has given me a special way of looking at the world and a special identity with others who experience some injustices. Themes I have dealt with are not because I sat down and said I wanted to make a political statement, but because of emotional experiences. For more than 6 decades, John Wilson made powerful works that reflected his life as a Black American artist and his quest for racial, social, and economic justice. Employing a figurative style across drawing, painting, printmaking, and sculpture, he responded to the turbulent times in which he lived, a period marked by unrest and upheaval, but also by expanding rights and a spirit of hope. Wilson was drawn to both the physical postures and interior worlds of his subjects, capturing their lived experiences and inherent beauty. He imagined different futures, exposed injustices, and fought for authentic and positive representations of Black Americans. Compassion and empathy suffuse his art, even as it conveys his anger at the wrenching effects of disenfranchisement and economic inequality. Challenging deep-seated prejudices and omissions in U.S. history, Wilson created images that evoke strength, dignity, and what he called a universal humanity. Profoundly personal yet widely resonant, his work continues to offer a powerful lens through which to consider today's most urgent dialogues. This online discussion with my wonderful co-curator, Dr. Leslie King Hammond, is the result of our current exhibition, as Deb mentioned, Witnessing Humanity, the Art of John Wilson, which was developed with our wonderful co-curators at the MFA, Edward Saywell and Patrick Murphy, and it will be on view through February 8th at the Met. So with that, I will turn over my screen to the PowerPoint and the camera to Dr. Leslie King Hammond.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am so thrilled to be here. I must say that this is a project that was a labor of love for the 4 curators involved. And now we get to really do a deep dive into what John Wilson was thinking, doing, and achieved in his career. Can we have the first image? Here you notice in this particular piece, Streetcar, in 1945, John Wilson is responding on a number of levels to the times of creation and activity in American art. He is, in fact, looking at what is going on in the realities of the world in which he is living. However, this image, Streetcar, is full of ironies. Here, a Black man sits in the front seat next to a white woman who pay close attention to the eyes and the individuals who are also in the streetcar, who are talking one behind him about his presence in the front seat, the woman sitting next to him who has her head slightly bent, and the individuals in the back who are slightly oblivious. This work was seriously impacted by by Wilson's awareness of what was going on in the earlier period of the Great Depression and what was commonly known as the Works Project Administration, or the WPA. Can we have the next image? In this piece, Raymond Steff, who was part of the Pennsylvania coalition, and let me say that the Federal Art Project had about 5,300 artists enrolled. The Works Project Administration was created to address the enormous joblessness that occurred in the United States at the time of 1929 when the Great Depression hit. There were estimated to be at least more than 7 million people without jobs. So this initiative, created by President Roosevelt at the time, was targeting American citizens between the ages of 18 to 65, and you had to be the sole individual in one person in that house who would be enrolled in this program so that you could make money. Here, Raymond Steff is doing something which is, again, a very resistant form of talking about the conditions in America. The artists in the Federal Art Project, the Work Project Administration, were designated to create works on American themes, Nothing more than that. Just talk about America. In this particular image, we see a father looking towards an apparition with a mother crouched down on the ground and two children on a mule, each of them having wings on their back on a landfill of detritus and a dog with wings. At the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, there were also signs that there would be 40 acres and a mule given to each emancipated slave. In fact, none of that happened. And so here we are in the era of the Depression. It's 1935. Things are very difficult. And John Wilson is looking at the works that these artists created that talked about the conditions in America. Next slide, please. In this image, one of the things that was also paramount in America was the building of industries, urbanization, technology. And in this one, Shipfitters, Doc Thrash, another artist from the Pennsylvania workshops, was talking about the industry as war was coming in the United States, where African Americans could find viable opportunities for employment. The Great Migration at that particular period that coincided with the Great Depression found African Americans moving from the South to northern cities, seeking better opportunities for education, employment, freedom, and experiencing the so-called democracies of the United States, which were severely denied them in the South. Shipfitters is a very personal piece to me because my father became a shipfitter. My family was Afro-Caribbean from the island of Barbados, and during the migration period, they migrated from the islands to the United States, also seeking better education, better living conditions, job opportunities. And my father worked for 25 years in the shipfitter industry, making battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines. Jennifer? Next slide.
Yes. It's not. Let's see, it should be advancing. There we go. Okay. So here we have adolescence. We have the drawing and the related lithograph. John Wilson was born in 1922 in Roxbury, which was a working class neighborhood in Boston, with a large Black, Jewish, and immigrant population. He was the second of 5 children in a very close-knit family. His parents were immigrants, as Leslie mentioned. They were from Guyana, and he discovered, especially his father, that work was very difficult to find during this period. So Wilson's father really worked with the children and very much encouraged John Wilson with his artistic production. So in adolescence, what we see here is what Wilson described as, quote, an imaginative interpretation of the street I lived on, end quote. Within this dark, claustrophobic, and impoverished urban space, a young boy stands alone and at a remove from others, concurrently part of the scene and in his own world. At his side, he clutches several books, which I can show you a detail here, which will come back into play later. And the books represent a connection with his father, with whom he had a joy of reading. They frequently read together, and later Wilson will read with his own children. Let's see. His belief in education as a means for finding a way out. Wilson explored the motif throughout his career, that of reading in a variety of mediums. Now, you'll notice a young boy in a t-shirt standing at the front. Wilson described him as a surrogate, quote, I don't even know if I was conscious of that boy in the foreground as a self-portrait or not, but I look back on it and clearly it's a self-portrait, end quote. He also made a self-portrait in oil paint of him as a young man in a similar white t-shirt. So this is motif. And this idea of Wilson addressing the viewer directly through surrogates in his art is something that we'll see again and again. And on the left, you can see the preliminary study where he also captured the sensations of alienation, estrangement, and economic and racial discrimination that he developed in the lithograph. He described adolescence as an attempt to, quote, express the bewilderment and search and understanding of a Black boy growing up in the midst of the inconsistencies, the squalor, and the cramped, poverty-stricken confusion of life in a typical North American Black ghetto. And you can see sketches in the margin that testify to the role of drawing. Drawing is something that Wilson will do throughout his career. He makes what he calls spot drawings, and he carries index cards with him, and he's always drawing there. He's also drawing on note cards from hotels and envelopes and things such as this. To return back to the neighborhood, which you can see developed here, he said, quote, I drew scenes of the world around me, which reflected the sense of alienation I felt as a Black artist in a segregated world. I saw no examples of art that depicted the people and the realities of the Black neighborhood I lived in, end quote. And Roxbury will loom large in Wilson's work of this period. You will see images of his family, of the street. You will see images of the row houses, the street lamps, and other motifs, and they create a portrait of his childhood neighborhood. Wilson described feeling safe there while also being aware of the economic inequality and racism. Quote, I grew up feeling pretty comfortable, and when I look back on my childhood, I have a sense of enjoying it. Now, again, there's a contradiction. But the minute you stepped out of the Black neighborhood, you knew exactly that you were in a foreign country. You simply didn't belong. All of the societal manifestations of rejection were there. This created a kind of solidarity in the Black community, end quote. Labor, economic inequality, and racial prejudices, and the connections between the three were central themes for Wilson, and we'll see him exploring them throughout his career. Let's see. Okay, this is a work he made in 1943, and it is the lithograph Deliver Us from Evil. So Wilson was in school during World War II, and this also relates to some of the earlier images he did of labor made around this time. Defense industries desegregated in 1941. And this was a work that he made for a classroom assignment. You might recognize the biblical passage from the title. And in this work, Wilson is drawing parallels between the genocide in Europe and American racism. And he has a German Jewish family, a father, a mother, and a child. And on the flip side is a Black family, father, mother, child. And this is actually based on historical fact. Of course, the Nazis looked at the American legal code, especially the Jim Crow laws, when developing the Nuremberg laws earlier. And what you can see here are images of cruelty, of evil. This was reproduced in the Marxist journal, The New Masses. And Wilson wanted to keep this title versus the suggested title, The Evils of Fascism, because he wanted to show that evil was throughout. It was both within the American society and those abroad. You might also notice this group of soldiers on the left, and in a related lithograph of 1944 called War Machine, Wilson wrote about this as, quote, the lithograph represents my response to the news reports of the invasion of many European countries by the German troops during the Second World War. I was an idealistic young African-American art student, struggling to find a way to express my fears and angers about the oppression of African-American people in America. For me, the ruthless, efficient, invincible German stormtroopers became a symbol of all powerful forces of oppression, in which individuals were modeled into collective killing machines, fueled by ideologies of hate and racial superiority. I identified with the victims of this Nazi army, And this print is my attempt to make a graphic image of the terror engendered by these troops, end quote. And I just want to say quick things. You might also notice that it has a frieze-like quality. It very much evokes a mural in its construction. This shows the impact of the Mexican muralist, which is an influence that is very strong on Wilson. And in the bottom right, you might notice this kind of Norisaklikite-like couple who are eating and drinking while pointing at a Black worker and a white worker in this violent fight. And this shows the kind of labor disputes within labor that are being generated by this capitalist economy. With this, I will turn this over to Leslie to say a few words.
One thing that Wilson was terribly adept at was loading his compositions with all kinds of signifiers. If you look deeply into this composition in the center to the rear, you will see several lynchings going on. And this is the backstory that when we talk about two worlds, two realities that W. Du Bois talked about in his Souls of Black Folks, John Wilson was so deeply embedded in the literary geniuses of the writers of that period of time that he tried to reflect this in his work. So here you see all of these things, and sometimes the things that you see that are very obvious are no less important than the ones, the images in the back, where you have bystanders and witnesses looking at the lynched bodies, which were there for popular entertainment at the time, as if human beings were non-beings, and that was okay to accuse them of any atrocity that was in possibly a figment of their imagination, but which African Americans had to consistently deal with on a regular basis. So we can go to the next image. And here in this one, Breadwinner, is another one of those ironic images where we see one, he was a fantastic draftsman, his facility in his ability to capture the human form. But here, Breadwinner, it talks about what happened to the Black males at that particular time, seeking jobs where they could find few jobs, and yet and still being the head of the family, trying to provide income, food, care, nurturing. And here, this gentleman sits on a bench with a lunchbox, open, empty, and again, talking about the whole idea of where am I going? What am I doing? The hopelessness, the kind of despair, the abject rejection of his presence and his role as a human being in America. Again, you see him here in the contrast of living in urbanization, which is also a phenomenon of this time because many African Americans have moved from the South into an urbanized northern complex of experiences which were very new to them. You have to realize that they came from a very pastoral experience, whether they came from the Caribbean and island culture or they came from the South, having dealt with farming and plantation and pastoral scenes like that. So here's this man caught between a rock and a hard place, not knowing where to go, where to get support. This is a work from 1942 at a time when the Works Project Administration, of which Wilson was not a member of, but this gentleman probably was one of the individuals who might not have been privileged by that experience. Next.
Well, I just want to add, you might
Yeah.
notice it says war. This was made right after the U.S. entry into World War II. And again, the factories desegregated during this time in order to increase production. You see a factory in the background with smokestacks that might refer to the surge in production. But Wilson writes around the fact that, quote, I resented the fact that almost everyone on my block was on welfare until they needed us in the shipyards and factories, end quote. And in fact, the image of the man in the streetcar scene that Leslie started the talk with was working in the naval shipyard. In the background, you can see the row houses that likely evokes Roxbury, a family or a mother and a woman and a child, which Leslie will talk about later in relation to family depictions. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but there's actually a hole in the shoe at the front, which speaks to difficulty, economic difficulty. So the next works were made when Wilson was in Paris. He won a fellowship to go to Europe, where he was between 1947 and 1950. He had hoped to go to Mexico, but there weren't fellowships to go to Mexico. He hoped to study mural painting with the muralist, but instead he was in Europe. And during that time, he went to the studio of Fernand Léger, where he hoped to study mural painting. Léger did not teach him mural painting, but instead worked with Wilson, and Wilson worked with him. And he really talked about the development in his formal visual language. And you'll notice it's very different than the works made earlier, still in a figurative sense. And what you see on the left is mode of production, and on the right is Boulevard de Strasbourg, which is the name of the street where Wilson lived while working with Léger. And Wilson credits Léger with helping him really focus on the impact of a pure line. And here you notice that in yellow and in red in the respective works. Quote, Wilson wrote, "A line is movement in itself," and that Léger liberated him from this form of naturalism that he had done before, as well as taught him to admire the man-made world. Now, Léger, of course, was a communist, and he had a very optimistic view of the future, the one that would combine socialism with this new technology that would liberate people from the long workday and manual work and allow a kind of greater leisure and enjoyment. And that's what we see on Boulevard de Strasbourg. We see a combination of people perhaps going to work as well as going around the street, and you can see them navigating the city. Through Léger, Wilson has this more geometric language, much more simplified. A kind of hallmark of Wilson's work are the exaggerated scale of the hands, which you'll notice again and again. And Wilson really, again, focuses on labor from the very beginning of his work all the way through. So it's not a coincidence that he is stressing the hands and the handmade and the manual, even in this image celebrating a kind of technology. And then this leads us to Wilson when he does go to Mexico in 1950. And while in Mexico, he works at the celebrated TGP print shop with his friend, Elizabeth Catlett, and other artists. And while there, he really wants to make a mural. And this is when Leslie will talk about, he finally does get to make a mural, which is entitled The Incident. And Wilson talks about this as, quote, "The aim of the Mexican muralist movement was to be a spokesperson for the common man. They wanted to create works of art expressing the realities of the forgotten ones, revealing their history, their celebration, and their struggles." And while he talked about mural painting as being a public art, in a way, printmaking can function a similar way, especially the prints that they made with TGP, because it is this kind of activist production, making prints as well as posters, often placed in public space. Wilson famously said he wanted to make as many prints as he could so that they could be distributed widely. So it is a much more democratic, collaborative medium, which in some ways goes back to the idea of mural painting, even though it is a singular work, a work on paper versus a large public piece. And you can see that with the image of the street, how in so many ways it relates to that of his Parisian works with the crowded street, unlike the kind of play with abstraction. You see it's in one way is much more representational. We can clearly see what everyone's holding, what they're doing, but you can see the simplified visual language that he got from Léger, as well as Olmec sculptures, many of which were being rediscovered in Mexico while he was there between 1950 and 1957, as well as an influence that he had from Paris, which is when he went to Musée de l'Homme and he looked at non-Western sculptures. So all of these influences are coming together. These are both lithographs, and I think he used the texture of the stone in a really phenomenal way in these works. And on the right, you can see again the image of the worker. This is not the image of the kind of almost sterile technological image that we saw with motor production with when he was in Paris, but rather this is physical and manual and very difficult. He's laying bricks. You see the exaggerated scale of his hands and the trowel, which evokes a work he made in Paris called Man with Trowel. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that Wilson only makes about a handful of purely abstract, non-representational works. And he's able to do it. The works are quite interesting, but he feels that he has a mission, which is to make representational art and to provide representation for those who have been overlooked, namely Black Americans. So he doesn't feel that he can make abstract work. But I think if you look at the background, if you look at the scaffolding and the rivets and these wonderful structures, you see him incorporating elements of abstraction in his work, even the patterns of the bricks, and even the figure of the man in his hat, how it's broken down into these forms that show a very clear knowledge of abstraction. The last thing I'll say is that this is also a time when there was great surge of construction in Mexico, especially Mexico City, where Wilson was living. And so he was very much, in many of these works, contrasting the people who had lived in Mexico City before this construction, before the influx of capital, and who are actually building these new constructions, but who at the same time are being priced out of their neighborhoods or their neighborhoods destroyed to make way for the construction. And he often plays with making the city much more harsh and geometric and abstract, and this much more kind of socialist realist depiction of the people themselves. While in Mexico, he also makes several works entitled Incident. This is one of them. This is a print of 1955. He focuses on depictions of violence during this period in many, many works. And this piece, it's actually a work made in response to the Korean War. And you can see in the background the fighter planes that are circling above, and that it's a kind of a fortress-like structure with ammunition and armaments on the roof. And I think looking at this work, this was one of two states. In the second state, the hand and arm are absent. You can see a range of art historical references from Kathy Kollwitz with the grieving figure to, I would argue, Mantegna with the dead Christ. And this gives a kind of a timelessness to the work, even though it was he claimed in relation to the Korean War. It also very much evokes the Tulsa Massacre. It evokes Guernica. It evokes wars, and especially bombings of civilians, aerial bombardments, broadly considered. It is a timeless image of grief. And I'll pass it over to Leslie.
Yes, and for a minute, can we go back to the other two images? I want to connect some dots. Wilson was very well aware of the global history of art and how to portray incidents of critical meaning and impact to the lives of ordinary people. saying that, we have to also recognize that he had relationships and was watching very carefully the impact of the works of Jacob Lawrence and Romeo Bearden, who were deeply connected to the worker and understood that the worker was the foundation, especially the Black worker, to the dynamics of creating America. Elizabeth Catlett was also a profound influence on him at this juncture because Elizabeth, having been expatriated to Mexico, found ways of aligning the history of the Mexican people with the challenges they had, along with the challenges with African Americans. And John Wilson and Elizabeth Catlett had enormous conversations. They were deeply connected. Next slide. When we get to the incident, in this particular incident of kind of reclamation of how globally, even within wars in other terrains beyond the United States, reflects back to the traumas that African Americans had to consistently be wary of. We see a woman lamenting, agonizing over the loss of a male partner, husband, brother, father, friend, another human being. Give me the next slide. Now, here in this particular work, which is extremely important, the incident, which is a study for a mural that no longer exists. Here we have really two, yes, and in this one here, we see Wilson standing next to the fully realized mural that was executed in Mexico. Unfortunately, it did not survive. However, the study does. So let's go back to the study. Here we are seeing a scene with two almost different approaches to how the terror, the trauma of riding with the reality of the Ku Klux Klan, who indiscriminately would attack families or target families. We look at the mother and the child here in terror because why? They are looking helplessly at these actions that are created to demean, to diminish them. We have to understand that the legacy of slavery in the United States, plantation slavery, was designed to diminish, to eradicate, to abolish the Black family, to decimate those connections so that there would be a control over the Black person and their body and whatever they could or could not do. So here we see this woman who is looking very much influenced by the Mexican artists of the time. Uh, Wilson is not as interested in the naturalistic representation as he is in loosening the forms and getting the emotion, the pathos, the terror, the horror, the consistent trauma that this mother and child, mother trying to protect the child. Here on the other side, we have a father with a gun trying to hopefully protect his family because, of course, he is helpless to protect the man who is already ensconced with the noose, with the hanging, with the Ku Klux Klan. So John Wilson was very much an angry man. John Wilson was a man trying to find a way to let people understand, to know, to feel, to emote how the human being, a human being, would weather these kinds of conditions and what was required for them to sustain a life of meaning and purpose. You want to go to the next one, Jennifer? Here is probably the works that talk closely about Wilson's upbringing within his own family. Wilson talked often about how, growing up, his father would read to him. He would sit on his father's lap and he would read the comics to him, and they would discuss the issues in the paper. We also have to look at the fact that here is a series of images done by an artist, a Black artist, of a father and a son, a Black father and a Black son. And these are images from the installation of the exhibition, which I hope you all get to see, where we see this compassion, this love, this caring, this passion for being a parent, being a caretaker, being a mentor. And here in the center is the maquette for a full life-size piece, a study, because what John Wilson has been trying to do is to figure out how in his drawings, which are really very physical for him, these are drawings that he spends an enormous amount of energy literally crafting as if on paper he was creating a surface, a means to evoke what a fully rendered sculpture would look like. So here we have this beautiful, beautiful sequence of a Black father and child. We have the reading sequences here. And if you look at the entire thematic works of African Americans, John Wilson probably stands alone at marking this at a crossroads where we have been led astray to believe that Black fathers have not been present in the lives of their children, in their and their lives. I remember talking with Roy Wilson at one point and asking him, what was it like having a father who was an artist, and he lived in the house, and he said, look, I was a teenager, being a teenager, and I'm trying to do what teenagers do. So at the time, they were not as aware. But when I asked the daughter, I said, what was it like with a father? And she said, oh, I was just a little kid running to the next room, trying to get to see my television program. And he would say, stop, freeze. And he would want to capture me. John Wilson was obsessed intentionally with capturing every gesture movement of the human body. And he used his family. He used that which was a mostly available to him 24/7 to practice, to experiment, to study, to wonder, to visualize, to repeat over and over and over. And so these images are some of the most quintessential images that talk about his love of life, family, and humanity. Next. Jennifer.
Yes, I'm looking for audio. Okay, so in addition, as we talked about labor remains a theme. John also worked as a illustrator. He made illustrations for journals, including The Reporter, which I'm showing you on the right. And the steel worker, you can see the drawing on the left. And I think with these works, what you can see is the emphasis on labor as well as on Black workers, which is something that goes all the way back to the very beginning when you think of streetcar scene or breadwinner. And again, you see the exaggerated hands as this image of force. You can see the bricks in the background, this kind of representation, this very almost abstract forms, in contrast with the detail of the worker on the front. And we really wanted to include these journals as well as the children's books, which Wilson made, because he really didn't distinguish between different types of mediums. The drawings for him that became reproduced as illustrations were incredibly important. And in many ways, you could think of the type of audience that they reach. They would reach people who perhaps did not know they were interested in art. And to go to the image on the right that speaks to what Leslie was talking about, which is the depictions of fatherhood. And you can see that the father essentially makes a kind of shelf on which his small child rests. And this is a work that was an illustration on the cover of the Reporter. It also was a large drawing. It was depicted in a small spot drawing, which is in the exhibition, where Wilson essentially creates a mini retrospective of all of his father and child motifs. And it was also realized as a small sculpture. And this speaks to something which I won't talk about here because we are devoted to paper, but that Wilson worked across mediums. We also have not shown you his paintings for the same reason, but they were an active part, especially of his early production. And the how he excelled really at every technique, every medium is really quite something. And that it wasn't, as you could see with the father and child, it wasn't a matter of copying, it was reinterpreting, it was using the qualities of each form to realize a new work, a distinct work. Okay, Leslie?
Yeah. Now, in 1986, Wilson won the commission to do a likeness memorial for Martin Luther King. This was a dream coming true because Wilson was now able to render in a permanent material, bronze, images that his whole life he had been working to realize. On the right-hand side, we see a marvelous etching and aquatint. And if you can, at some point, when the Print Foundation gets the taping of the webinar we did with 3 artists who talked about this particular piece, it was absolutely incredible. But the aquatint here and etching was done in so many states, on so many levels, so that you could see him trying to pull out the emotive qualities. He wasn't as interested in the actual representation naturalistically of this man without imbuing it with the emotive power that Martin Luther King rendered upon this United States. But also, he had a powerful impact on Wilson in his words, in his attitude, in the modeling of his behavior. I spent a lot of time reading the letters of Martin Luther King, and in Martin Luther King's analysis of Americans' badness and ill-begotten behavior with Americans and their attitudes towards people of color, it became very clear that this left an indelible impact on Wilson. So here are at least one state of the print, and in his working through this, he went through, I think, at least 10 or 15 different states before he resolved this one, which is just exquisite, and you must see it in person. For Wilson to have a piece in bronze in the U.S. Capitol was a dream realized, but it did not stop him, because 1986 was that pivotal point where his energies were becoming far more solidified, and he was becoming extremely clear about the kind of imagery, the kind of impact he wanted his work to have. Jennifer?
Yes, I just want to add saying that Joseph Norman, who, as Leslie mentioned, gave a wonderful talk last week. He noted that in to him in the print on the right, there's a sense of resignation, almost as if King knows what will happen. And indeed, I think you can look at the horizontal line in dialogue with the vertical line down his chest. He's described as being in his famous Brooks Brothers suit, but here it looks almost like a cross, going back to his background as a minister, his work in the ministry, also martyrdom. And it also evokes the idea of the crosshairs, the idea of the assassination that would happen. And to Joseph, as he was talking about it, there's a sense of knowing this. There's a sense of resignation of what will likely happen because of his actions and his leadership. And I think this is a very different image of Dr. King than one would expect. It's certainly not him with the March on Washington. It's in many ways a very private interior image. And because of that, I think it connects in a way, in an incredible way, as a person, as the bravery of the person. And I think it's something that Wilson also talks about with, you might notice the kind of dots and smudges on the right. And those are actually impressions from his own body, from Wilson's body. They're the thumb print and fingerprints. And you can think about how these are individual marks. And they were in the soft ground, and they are now part of the work, the heel of the hand. So the fact that there's this trace of Wilson's body, the directness of his body on the work, which now lives on, I think, for me, I find it very, very touching in this sense.
No, wait a minute. And in this sense also too, it talks about the interiority of the Black psyche at this juncture in a man's life, and the physicality that goes with understanding where your fate in the world will be located. And Wilson literally physically working on this print with his hands allows us to see the passion with which he felt about the impact of this man on not just the world, but also Wilson's life. Next.
And another key influence is Richard Wright, and this is,
Yes.
you can see Native Son is 1945, and then we'll also look at the Richard Wright Suite of 2001. So that's almost a 6-decade span. And almost every decade, we see Wilson making a work that is either directly based on Richard Wright or that evokes him in many ways. And that Wilson talks about his art as trying to make visible what Richard Wright did in words. Now, they were in many of the same cities, Chicago and Paris. We don't believe they ever met. So that's rather unfortunate, because Wilson had incredible correspondence and connections with a wide variety of artists and intellectuals. Paul Robeson, Elizabeth Catlett, as Leslie mentioned, Robert Blackburn, Jacob Lawrence, the list goes on and on. But unfortunately, we don't believe he had any direct connection or even writing correspondence with Richard Wright. Okay, Leslie?
Okay, and what I think people need to understand is that the importance of Richard Wright is profound, because it was Richard Wright in his 2 novels, Black Boy in 1954 and Native Son, that actually Black Boy was 19, the lithograph, but Black Boy was written in 45 and Native Son was 1940. Wilson read both of these books, and these books were a shock to the United States literary scene, because they were the first ones written by a major author that literally outlined from lived experiences the violence and the racialization of Black people in America. And I think what happened with Wilson is that as he read these 2 novels, because when he wasn't drawing, he was reading, he was informing himself. Remember, his father, he and his father read together. His father read to him. Reading was very, very important within the cosmos of the family's development. And so here he is paying homage to the magnificence of what he felt was an affirmation of the very thing that he was trying to convey in his imagery. Next, Jennifer.
Yes, and just from Freda, Jennifer's gonna wrap up with this wonderful imagery, and then we're gonna forego questions. But if people do have questions, they can send them emails. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so this is the Richard Wright Suite of 2001, and you got a quick glimpse of the book Down by the Riverside. The same year, both etching and aquatint. The book has about 4 of the images of here we see 6, the complete story. And you probably, this is a book that John Wilson chose. So he chose this to engage Richard Wright here. And in the book, he talks about what it means for him. It tells the story of the Mann family. The first image is the journey of the Mann family. And it's about Brother Mann and his wife Lulu, his child, his son Pee-wee, and then Lulu's mother, as they attempt to get Lulu to the hospital. She's very pregnant in safely. And it is during a historic flood of the Mississippi. They end up with a rope. They stay very long, perhaps a bit too long, on their land. He's a tenant farmer. So this again comes to the economics of who is able to leave when there's natural disasters and who must stay, and what it means to abandon a farm and your livelihood. He's in a rowboat, which turns out to have been stolen. Brother Mann did not steal it, someone else did. This sets off a chain of actions that lead to the death of the boat owner. Lulu gets to the hospital too late, the death of Lulu and their baby, and eventually the murder of Brother Mann. And I just want to say in this set, this was made by Jim Stroud, who spoke in the talk the other week. You can see that Wilson uses a very beautiful color palette, which is very different than the book, which is a kind of chalky yellow. Here are these lush tones of blue, no two are alike, but he captures the kind of almost sleet-like sensation of the rain and the danger of the rain and what this means. And I think it's a work that has incredible resonance, because it very much anticipates the images that we would see with Katrina, and we're now on the 20th anniversary of that. And so it's a work that remains very topical. And you could think about this, how long Wilson had this engagement, and that these themes of family as well as social justice remain consistent over the course of almost 7 decades. Okay, with that, I turn it to Leslie.
Well, again, Richard Wright is a subject that never leaves Wilson's psyche. He will continue and does continue throughout the rest of his career to look at the remainder of these artists. Can we go to the last slide?
The portraits?
Yes, the portraits. This is probably a beautiful summation, which talks about the resilience and the resistance of the Black family to be disconnected from the reality of being a whole center of survival. That allowed them to thrive, survive, and today resonate strongly in the community of Roxbury and across the United States. Each one of these images, which are individuals he knew, his daughter in the center, his daughter up to the right, all of these individuals were people who lived in his community, some of whom were still alive at the time of the opening and were present at the opening, which was a very special time for them to see the impact that their work was having on a larger scale. It talks about a kind of pathos. It talks about a melancholy. It talks about a despair, but it also talks about the profound strength of human beings to travail and to find a way, to make a way, to establish themselves in a world that is so contested, riddled with so many hostilities, and yet and still they will prevail. They will succeed.
Okay, well, thank you. This is our last image. That was beautiful. I just want to tell people that next week, this time at noon until 1:30 on Wednesday, we will have the Met Print Study Day. And the theme this year is printmaking, mobility, and artistic networks from the 15th to the 20th century, where presentations by Femke Spielberg, Emily Floyd, and one of the authors from our John Wilson catalog, Lizetta LaFell Collins, who is a pioneering art historian and looking at the relationship between American artists, especially Black American artists, and Mexico. And she will be talking about John Wilson in Mexico in great depth. And she was able to actually talk to all these people. She talked to John Wilson. She knew Elizabeth Catlett. So it should be a really phenomenal presentation. We encourage you to come by.
Thank you, Jennifer and Leslie. Thank you, Freda and Deb, for that incredible program. We do have Met Print Study Day next week. We also have on Monday, the next webinar, another program presented by our friends at Print Council of America, from the WPA to Brandex Editions, the long history of screen printing at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, with Louis Marcasano, Emily Friedman, and Laurel Garber. So we hope very much to see you all on Monday online at noon Eastern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.